Sit close, children, and listen to the story of how the coyote brought fire to the people.
Before the hanging tree cast its shadow over Mankato, before the rope and the scaffold became the final answer to our cries for bread, I knew the taste of wild rice harvested from the lakes of our fathers, the weight of a full belly, and the sound of my mother's laughter as she worked the hides in the autumn sun. My name is Tathanka Nazing, which the white men would call Standing Buffalo. Though I was neither chief nor elder, only a young man of 20 winters, when the world I knew began to crack like river ice in the spring thaw. I was Dakota of the Mediwakanton band, and I lived in the valley of the Minnesota River, where the cottonwoods grew thick and the deer were so plentiful that a hunter needed only patience and a steady hand to feed his family through the long cold. I remember the old ways with a clarity that burns, the way a man remembers the face of his mother before she is taken by the coughing sickness, every line and shadow preserved in the amber of memory. We were a people of the seasons, our lives turning like the great wheel of the sky. In the spring, when the ice broke on the river and the geese returned from the south in great honking formations that darkened the sky, we tapped the maples for their sweet blood, hanging birch bark containers on the trunks and collecting the clear sap that we would boil down into sugar, a process that took days of constant tending, feeding the fires, watching the liquid darken and thicken until it reached the perfect consistency. The smell of maple sugar boiling is one of the first smells I remember from my childhood, sweet and smoky, mixing with the scent of the earth thawing after the long winter, the rich, dark smell of soil coming back to life. We planted our corn in the rich black earth near the river bends, in the places where the floods had deposited layers of fertile silt, and we planted beans and squash alongside the corn, the three sisters we called them, each plant helping the others, the corn providing a pole for the beans to climb, the beans fixing nitrogen in the soil, the squash spreading its broad leaves to shade the ground and keep the moisture in. My mother and my sisters did most of the planting, working with digging sticks and hoes made from the shoulder blades of buffalo, their hands moving with practiced efficiency, making holes in the earth, dropping in the seeds, covering them, moving on to the next spot, their voices rising in song as they worked, old songs about the corn spirit and the gifts of the earth. In summer, when the sun was high and hot and the prairie grass grew tall enough to brush the belly of a horse, we moved to follow the buffalo, though they had grown scarce even then, pushed westward by the endless tide of white faces that poured into our lands like floodwater through a broken dam. I remember my first buffalo hunt. I was 14 winters old, and my father took me with the men, riding west for 3 days until we found a small herd grazing near a creek. The hunt was a sacred thing, not just a matter of killing for meat, but a ceremony, a dance between the hunter and the hunted, a recognition that the buffalo gave its life so that we might live, and that we owed it respect and gratitude. We approached downwind, crawling through the grass on our bellies, our bows strung and ready, and when we were close enough, my father gave the signal and we rose as one and let our arrows fly. I shot at a young cow, my arrow striking her behind the shoulder, and she ran, and I ran after her, my heart pounding, my legs burning. And when she finally fell, I knelt beside her and I placed my hand on her head, and I thanked her spirit for the gift of her body, for the meat that would feed my family, for the hide that would keep us warm, for the sinew and bone and horn that we would use to make tools and weapons and ornaments. My father showed me how to butcher her properly, how to make the cuts so that no meat was wasted, how to remove the hide in one piece, how to take the organs and clean them and prepare them for eating. We carried the meat back to camp on our horses, and that night there was a feast, and my mother cooked the liver and the heart and the tongue, and we ate until our bellies were tight and round, and the old men told stories of the great hunts of their youth, when the buffalo were so numerous that the earth shook with their passing, when a man could ride for days and never see the end of the herd. But those days were gone even then, and we all knew it though we did not speak of it, as if speaking would make it more real, more final. In autumn, we harvested the wild rice from the shallow lakes, standing in our canoes and bending the stalks over the gunnels, beating them with sticks so the grains fell like brown rain into the boat bottoms. This was work that required skill and timing, because if you harvested too early, the grains would not be ripe, and if you waited too long, they would fall into the water and be lost. My grandmother, Ungchi, was the best rice harvester in our village, her movements smooth and rhythmic, her stick striking the stalks with just the right force, not so hard that the grains shattered, not so soft that they did not fall. She taught me the songs that you sing while harvesting rice, songs that thank the water and the plants and the spirits that watch over the lakes, songs that ensure a good harvest and safe passage across the water. After the rice was harvested, we would parch it over fires to dry it and loosen the hulls, and then we would pound it in wooden mortars to remove the chaff, and then we would winnow it, tossing it in the air on birch bark trays so that the wind carried away the light hulls and the heavy grains fell back into the tray. The rice we stored in leather bags, and it would last us through the winter, a staple food that we could boil with meat or maple sugar or dried berries, to have food that connected us to the lakes and the water and the cycles of growth and harvest that had sustained our people for generations beyond counting. In winter, when the snow lay deep and the river froze solid enough to walk on, when the days were short and the nights were long and cold, we gathered in our lodges around fires that smelled of cedar and sage, and the children learned who they were, where they came from, and what it meant to be Dakota. The old ones told the stories of the creation of the world, how the Great Spirit made the earth and the sky and the waters, how he made the animals and the plants and finally the people, how he gave each people a place and a purpose and a way of living. They told stories of our ancestors, of the great chiefs and warriors and medicine men who had led our people through times of plenty and times of hardship, stories of battles won and lost, of visions received and prophecies fulfilled, of the sacred pipe and the sun dance and the vision quest and all the ceremonies that connected us to the spirit world and gave meaning to our lives. They told stories of Iktomi, the trickster spider, who was always getting into trouble because of his greed and his vanity and his foolishness, stories that made us laugh but also taught us lessons about humility and respect and the consequences of breaking the natural order. I loved those winter nights, the warmth of the fire, the smell of the smoke, the sound of my grandmother's voice rising and falling as she told the old tales, the feeling of being part of something larger than myself, part of a people, a tribe, a nation that stretched back into the mists of time and would, I believed then, continue forward into the future forever. I was taught by my father, Wichingyang King, the old man, though he was not so old then, perhaps 40 winters, his braids still black as a raven's wing, with only a few threads of silver at his temples. He was a hunter and a warrior, respected in the village for his skill and his wisdom and his generosity. He taught me to track the white-tailed deer through snow so deep it came to my waist, to read the signs of their passing, the hoof prints and the droppings and the places where they had scraped the bark from trees, to eat the inner cambium, to understand their patterns of movement, where they bedded down during the day, where they came to drink at dawn and dusk, how to approach them from downwind so they would not catch your scent and bolt before you could get within bow range. He taught me to read the signs of weather in the color of the sunset and the flight of geese, to know when a storm was coming by, the way the clouds built up in the west, and the way the wind shifted and the way the animals behaved, growing restless and seeking shelter. He taught me to speak to the spirits with tobacco and prayer, to make offerings at the sacred places, the springs and the groves and the hilltops where the veil between this world and the spirit world was thin, to fast and seek visions that would guide me on my path, to understand that all things were connected in the great web of life, that the stone and the tree and the wolf and the man were all relations, all part of the sacred hoop that had no beginning and no end. He taught me what it meant to be a man, to be brave in the face of danger, to be generous with what you had, to protect the weak and the helpless, to speak the truth even when it was difficult, to honor your word and your commitments, to respect the elders and listen to their counsel, to love your family and your people above all else. He taught me by example, by the way he lived his life, and I tried to follow in his footsteps, though I knew I could never be the man he was, could never have his patience or his wisdom or his quiet strength. My mother, Angpetu Washte, Beautiful Day, was a woman of quiet strength, her hands never idle, always working, tanning hides or sewing moccasins or grinding corn or weaving baskets from the sweet grass that grew along the riverbanks. She sang as she worked, old songs that her grandmother had taught her, songs about the creation of the world and the adventures of Iktomi the trickster and the love between the earth and the sky. She had a voice like water over stones, clear and musical. And when she sang, people would stop what they were doing and listen, and for a moment, the troubles of the world would fade away, and there would be only the beauty of her voice and the ancient words of the songs. She was the one who taught me about plants, about which ones were good to eat, and which ones were medicine and which ones were poison. She taught me to recognize the wild turnips that grew on the prairie, their white flowers like stars in the grass, and how to dig them up without damaging the roots, and how to peel them and slice them and dry them for winter. She taught me about the bark of the willow, which you could chew to ease pain and reduce fever, and the leaves of the sage, which you could burn to purify a space or a person, and the roots of the echinacea, which strengthened the body against sickness. She taught me that the earth was our mother, that she provided everything we needed if we knew how to look, if we treated her with respect and took only what we needed and gave thanks for her gifts. I had 2 sisters, both younger, Wichapi, Star, who was 15 winters and already promised to a young man from another band, a good man named Changtewashte, Good Heart, who had given my father 3 horses and a rifle as a bride price, and who looked at my sister with such adoration that it made me smile and feel a little jealous at the same time. Wichapi was beautiful, with long black hair that she wore in 2 braids wrapped with otter fur, and eyes that sparkled with intelligence and mischief. She was skilled at beadwork, creating intricate patterns on moccasins and dresses and pouches, patterns that told stories or represented visions, or simply celebrated the beauty of color and form. She would sit for hours with her beads and her sinew thread, her needle flashing in the firelight, creating beauty out of simple materials, and I would watch her and marvel at her patience and her skill. My younger sister, Tesangwing, White Buffalo Woman, who was only 8 winters, was still small enough to ride on my shoulders when we walked to the fishing places in the spring. She was a wild thing, always running, always laughing, always getting into trouble, climbing trees and wading in the river and chasing the dogs, and generally making a nuisance of herself in the way that young children do. But she was also sweet and affectionate, and she would climb into my lap in the evenings and ask me to tell her stories, and I would tell her about the time I killed my first deer, or the time I saw a bear fishing in the river, or the time I got lost in the woods and had to spend the night alone and how I was scared, but I sang the songs my father had taught me, and the spirits protected me and guided me home in the morning. She would listen with wide eyes, her small hand in mine, and when the story was done she would sigh with contentment and fall asleep against my chest, and I would carry her to her sleeping robes and tuck her in and feel a fierce protectiveness, a determination that nothing would ever harm her, that I would give my life to keep her safe. We lived in a bark lodge near the agency at Yellow Medicine, close enough to receive the annuity payments that the government had promised us in the treaties that had taken our land piece by piece. First the land east of the Mississippi in 1837, then the land west of it in 1851, until we were confined to a narrow strip along the Minnesota River, a strip that was 10 miles wide and 150 miles long, a strip that grew narrower every year as the surveyors came with their chains and stakes and marked off more land for the settlers who arrived in their wagons, their faces hard with hunger and hope, their children staring at us as if we were creatures from a dream or a nightmare. Our lodge was made of elm bark sheets tied to a frame of bent saplings, large enough to house our family and provide space for cooking and sleeping and working. In the center was the fire pit, ringed with stones, and above it was a smoke hole that could be opened or closed depending on the weather. Around the walls were our sleeping platforms, raised off the ground and covered with buffalo robes and blankets, and hanging from the poles were our possessions, our clothes and tools and weapons, and the bags of food we had stored for winter. It was a good lodge, warm in winter and cool in summer, and it smelled of smoke and leather and the sweet grass that my mother scattered on the floor. The treaties promised us money, food, and supplies in exchange for our land, payments that were supposed to come every year, payments that were supposed to keep us from starving as the game disappeared and the prairie was broken by the plow. The government promised us $50,000 a year for 50 years to be paid in cash and goods, and they promised us schools and blacksmiths and farmers to teach us the white man's ways, because they said we could no longer live as hunters, that the buffalo were gone, and we must learn to farm and raise cattle and live in houses and wear their clothes and speak their language. Some of our people tried to do this, tried to walk the white road, cutting their hair and putting on the white man's pants and shirts and building log cabins and plowing fields and planting wheat. Little Crow was one of these. He had a frame house and a farm, and he wore a black suit and a top hat when he went to the agency, trying to show the whites that we could change, that we could adapt, that we deserved to be treated with respect. But the payments were always late, and when they came, they were always less than promised, and the food was often spoiled, the flour full of weevils, the pork rancid, the blankets thin and torn. The traders at the agencies, men like Andrew Myrick and Nathan Myrick and Louis Robert and James Lind, grew fat on our misery, extending credit to us at outrageous rates, taking our annuity money before we ever saw it, selling us goods at prices that would make a saint weep with rage. They had a system, these traders, a system that kept us in perpetual debt, perpetual dependence. They would sell us flour and sugar and coffee and cloth on credit, marking it down in their ledgers, and when the annuity payment came, they would present their bills to the agent, and the agent would pay them first before we received a single dollar. And often there was nothing left for us after the traders had taken their share. And their prices were outrageous, charging us 3 or 4 times what the goods were worth, knowing that we had no choice, that we could not go elsewhere, that we were trapped. I remember standing in Myrick's store one day, looking at a sack of flour that he was selling for $5, and knowing that the same flour could be bought in St. Paul for $1, and feeling the rage build in my chest, but swallowing it down because what could I do? I needed the flour, my family needed to eat, and I had no money. So I took the credit and I signed my mark in his ledger, and I carried the flour home, and I felt like less than a man, like a beggar, like a slave. The whites who came to our lands, the settlers, they were not all bad people. Some of them were kind, some of them tried to treat us fairly, but they were taking our land. They were plowing up the prairie where the buffalo had grazed. They were cutting down the forests where we had hunted. They were building their fences and their roads and their towns. And with each farm, with each fence, with each town, our world grew smaller. The game grew scarcer, and we grew more dependent on the annuity payments, more dependent on the traders, more dependent on the very people who were destroying us. I remember standing on a hill one day, looking out over the valley, and seeing the smoke from a dozen settler cabins rising into the sky, and seeing the fields of wheat where once there had been prairie grass, and seeing the stumps of trees where once there had been forest, and feeling a despair so deep it was like drowning, like being pulled underwater and not being able to breathe, because I knew that this was the future, that the old ways were dying, that my children would not know the life I had known, would not hunt the buffalo or harvest the wild rice, or hear the stories of the ancestors told around the winter fires, that they would be something else, something neither Dakota nor white, something lost and broken and adrift. I remember standing in line at the agency warehouse in the summer of 1862, the summer when everything changed, the summer when the sky itself seemed to hold its breath. It was August, and the corn in our fields was withering because the rains had not come, the stalks turning brown and brittle, the ears small and undeveloped, and the game was scarce. The deer and the elk had moved away, driven off by the settlers and their guns, and our children were crying with hunger, their bellies swollen, their eyes dull, their skin hanging loose on their bones. We had been waiting for weeks for the annuity payment, the payment that was supposed to come in June, then July, and now it was August, and still nothing. The agent, a man named Thomas Galbraith, told us the money had not arrived from Washington, that there was some delay, some bureaucratic problem, that we must wait, that we must be patient. But patience is a luxury of the full belly, and our bellies were empty. We gathered at the agency, hundreds of us, warriors and elders and women with babies on their backs, and we asked, we begged, for food from the warehouses. We could see the sacks of flour and corn through the windows, stacked to the ceiling, enough to feed us all for months, food that belonged to us, food that had been purchased with our annuity money, food that we had every right to. But Galbraith refused. He said we must wait for the payment, that he could not distribute the food without authorization from Washington, that it was against the rules, that his hands were tied. We argued, our voices rising in anger and desperation, and some of the young men began to push against the doors of the warehouse, and the soldiers who guarded the agency raised their rifles, and the tension was like a bowstring pulled tight, ready to snap. Finally, one of our chiefs, a man named Little Crow Thaoyate Duta, spoke. Little Crow was a complicated man, a man who had tried to walk the white man's road, who had cut his hair and worn their clothes and lived in a frame house and farmed a plot of land, trying to show his people that we could survive in this new world. He had been to Washington, had met with the president, had seen the power and the numbers of the whites, and he knew that we could not fight them and win. But even he could see that the white man's promises were written on water, that they meant nothing when it suited them to mean nothing. He spoke with great dignity, his voice calm but firm, and he told Galbraith that our people were starving, that the children were dying, that we had sold our land for the promise of these payments, and that it was the government's duty, their obligation under the treaty, to feed us. He said that we had been patient, that we had waited and waited, but that our patience was at an end, that we needed food now, today, not next week or next month. Galbraith listened with a face like stone, his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes cold and distant, and when Little Crow was finished, he turned to the traders, to Andrew Myrick and the others who stood behind him, and he asked if they would extend more credit to us until the payment arrived. There was a long silence, and then Andrew Myrick, a man whose face I can still see in my nightmares, a face like a weasel, narrow and sharp, with small eyes that held no warmth, no mercy, no humanity, looked at us with contempt, his lip curling in a sneer, and he said words that I will carry to my grave, words that sealed his fate and the fate of hundreds of others. He said, "If they are hungry, let them eat grass or their own dung." The silence that followed was like the silence before a thunderstorm, a silence so heavy it pressed against the ears, a silence that seemed to suck all the air out of the world. I felt the rage rise in my chest like a living thing, hot and choking, a rage so intense that my vision blurred and my hands shook, and I wanted to leap across the space between us and tear his throat out with my bare hands. I saw the same rage in the eyes of every man around me, saw their jaws clench and their fists tighten, and their bodies go rigid with fury. Little Crow's face did not change, but his eyes became like black stones, hard and cold and utterly without mercy, and I knew in that moment that something had broken, something fundamental and irreparable, something that could not be mended with words or apologies, or even with food and money. The bond of trust, such as it was, the thin thread that had held us back from violence, had been severed, and what would follow would be terrible and bloody and inevitable. We left the agency that day without food, and we returned to our villages, and the anger spread like wildfire through dry grass, leaping from lodge to lodge, from band to band, carried by runners and by the drumbeat of rage that pulsed through our people like a heartbeat. The young men, the warriors, we gathered in the council lodges and we spoke of war. We spoke of taking back what was ours, of driving the white settlers from our lands, of burning their farms and killing their livestock, and making them pay for every broken promise, every insult, every child who had died of hunger while the warehouses sat full. We spoke of Andrew Myrick and what we would do to him, how we would make him eat his words, how we would stuff his mouth full of grass and leave his body for the crows. The elders counseled caution. They spoke of the power of the United States, of the endless numbers of soldiers they could send against us, of the cannons and the rifles and the railroads that could bring armies to our lands in a matter of days. They spoke of the futility of fighting a war we could not win, of the certainty that we would be crushed, that our people would be scattered or killed, that the retribution would be swift and terrible. They urged us to wait, to try to negotiate, to send delegations to Washington to complain about the agent and the traders, to seek justice through the white man's courts and laws. But the young men, we did not want to hear about caution. We did not want to hear about the future. We did not want to hear about negotiations and courts and laws that had never protected us, that had only been used to take more and more from us until we had nothing left. We wanted justice. We wanted revenge. We wanted to feel like men again instead of beggars at the white man's door, instead of dogs waiting for scraps from the table. We wanted to strike back, to make them feel our pain, to show them that we were not broken, not defeated, not willing to simply lie down and die. On the night of August 17th, 4 young men from the Mdewakanton band, young men whose names I will not speak because they are dead now and their spirits deserve peace, went hunting for food near the settlement of Acton, a small cluster of farms about 40 miles north of the agency. They were hungry, desperate, angry, and when they found a nest of hen's eggs on a farm belonging to a man named Robinson Jones, one of them took the eggs because he was hungry, and he saw no reason why he should starve while the whites had plenty. Another man, perhaps trying to prove his courage, perhaps simply reckless with the rage that consumed us all, said that taking the eggs was cowardly, that if they were true warriors, they would take what they wanted openly, that they would not sneak around like thieves. Words led to a dare, and the dare led to a challenge, and the challenge led to action. They went to the Jones house and they demanded food. And when Jones refused, they shot him. And then, because they had crossed the line, because they had killed a white man and they knew there was no going back, they killed 4 more settlers that day, 3 men and 2 women, shooting them down, taking their guns and their horses and whatever food they could find, and then riding back to the village in a state of wild exhilaration and terror, knowing that they had started something that could not be stopped. When they returned to the village and told what they had done, the council was called immediately, the drums summoning the chiefs and the elders and the warriors to the council lodge. We all knew what this meant. We knew that the soldiers would come, that there would be retribution, that the fragile peace, such as it was, had been shattered beyond repair. The debate raged through the night, voices rising and falling, men standing to speak their minds, the pipe passing from hand to hand, the fire burning low and then being built up again as the hours passed, and no decision was reached. Some argued that we should surrender the 4 young men to the authorities, that we should try to make peace, to explain that it was the act of a few hotheads, not the will of the people, that we should distance ourselves from their actions and hope that the whites would be reasonable, would punish only the guilty and leave the rest of us in peace. But others argued that it was too late for that the whites would not distinguish between the guilty and the innocent, that they would punish us all regardless, that they had been looking for an excuse to drive us from our lands completely, and that these killings would give them that excuse. They argued that if we were to be punished anyway, we should at least fight. We should at least die as warriors rather than as dogs, that we should strike first and strike hard, that we should kill as many of them as we could before they killed us, that we should make them pay a price so high that they would remember us, that they would fear us, that they would know that the Dakota were not a people to be trifled with. Little Crow sat silent for a long time, listening to the arguments, his face grave, his eyes distant, as if he could see the future unfolding before him like a dark road leading into a darker forest. He had been a warrior in his youth, had counted coup and taken scalps, and earned his place among the leaders of his people, but he had also seen the futility of fighting the whites, had seen the endless tide of settlers, had seen the cities and the factories and the armies, and he knew that we could not win. Finally, as the first light of dawn began to filter through the smoke hole of the lodge, he rose to speak, and the lodge fell silent, every eye turning to him, every ear straining to hear his words. He spoke slowly, carefully, weighing each word, and he said that fighting the whites was like fighting the leaves of the trees in autumn, that for every one we killed, 10 more would come, and then 100, and then 1,000, until we were all dead or driven from our lands forever. He said that he had been to their cities, had seen their numbers, had seen their weapons, and that we could not win, that it was madness to think we could. He said that if we went to war we would be destroyed, that our women and children would be killed or scattered, that our names would be forgotten, that everything we had fought for, everything our ancestors had built, would be lost. But then his voice changed, and he said that he understood the rage, the desperation, the need to strike back, the need to feel like men instead of slaves. He said that he understood that we had been pushed beyond endurance, that the whites had taken everything from us and given us nothing in return but broken promises and contempt. He said that he understood that sometimes a man must fight, even when he knows he cannot win, that sometimes death is preferable to dishonor, that sometimes the only choice left is how you will die, on your feet or on your knees. He said that if his people were determined to go to war, he would lead them, not because he believed we could win, but because a chief does not abandon his people, even when they walk a path to destruction. He said that he would lead us, and we would fight and we would die, but we would die as Dakota, as warriors, as free men, not as slaves or beggars or broken remnants of a once great people. The council voted for war. The decision was not unanimous. Some of the older chiefs and elders voted against it, but the majority, especially the young warriors, voted to fight, and so it was decided. I remember the feeling in my chest as the decision was made, a mixture of exhilaration and terror, the feeling of a man who leaps from a cliff not knowing if he will fly or fall, the feeling of crossing a threshold from which there is no return. I went to my father's lodge, and I told him what had been decided, and he looked at me with eyes full of sorrow and pride, and he said, "Then you must be brave, my son, and you must remember who you are, no matter what happens. You must fight with honor. You must not harm women or children. You must not torture or mutilate. You must kill only those who are your enemies, and when you kill, you must do it quickly and cleanly, and you must pray for their spirits and for your own. War is a terrible thing. It brings out the worst in men. But you must not let it make you into a monster. You must remain Dakota. You must remain human, no matter what you see, no matter what you do." I promised him that I would, though I did not know if I could keep that promise, if any man could keep that promise in the chaos and horror of war. I went to the place where we kept our weapons, and I took down my grandfather's war club, a heavy stone head bound to a wooden handle with rawhide, the stone worn smooth by generations of use, stained dark with the blood of enemies long dead. I took my bow, a powerful weapon made from the wood of the Osage orange tree, a wood that grew far to the south and was traded north at great expense, a wood that was strong and flexible and could send an arrow through a buffalo at 50 paces. I took my quiver of arrows, each one carefully crafted, the shafts straight and true, the points made from iron traded from the whites or chipped from flint in the old way, the fletching made from the feathers of hawks and eagles, each arrow a work of art and a tool of death. I took my knife, a long blade of steel with a handle wrapped in leather, a knife that I had used to butcher deer and to skin beaver, and to cut meat and now would use to cut men. I painted my face with the red and black paint of war, the red for blood and courage, the black for death and mourning, the paint that said I was ready to kill and ready to die, the paint that transformed me from a man into a warrior, into an instrument of vengeance. My mother wept, but she did not try to stop me. She knew that this was the path I had chosen, the path that all the young men were choosing, and she knew that nothing she could say would change my mind. She held me for a long moment, her arms tight around me, her tears wetting my shoulder, and she whispered a prayer for my safety, a prayer to the spirits to watch over me and bring me home. My sisters looked at me with wide eyes, witch-happy with fear and sadness, knowing that her brother was going to war and might not return, and little Pitasangwing with confusion, not fully understanding what was happening, asking if I was going to fight the bad men, and I told her yes, I was going to make them pay for what they had done to us. And she said that I should be careful and that she would miss me. And I kissed her forehead and told her to be good and to help Mother and that I would come back soon. A lie that I told to comfort her, a lie that I half believed myself because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. I made a vow that night, a vow to the spirits of my ancestors, to the memory of the children who had starved, to the ghosts of the old ones who had watched our world crumble. I vowed that I would make the white men feel our pain, that I would take from them what they had taken from us, that I would not rest until the debt was paid in blood. I vowed that Andrew Myrick, the man who had told us to eat grass, would eat grass himself before I was done. I vowed that I would fight with courage and honor, that I would not shame my family or my people, that I would die if necessary, but that I would die well, that my death would mean something, would be remembered, would be a testament to the fact that the Dakota had not gone quietly into the darkness, that we had fought, that we had resisted, that we had refused to be erased. If you believe their story deserves to be heard, take a moment to support our channel with a like and subscribe. It ensures these forgotten histories are never truly lost. The war began at dawn on August 18th. We moved in groups, bands of warriors painted and armed, spreading out across the Minnesota River Valley like a dark stain, like a flood, like the wrath of the spirits made manifest. Our first target was the lower agency, the place where Myrick and the other traders had grown rich on our suffering, the place where we had been told to eat grass, the place that symbolized everything that was wrong with the new order, everything that had brought us to this point. We struck fast and hard, overwhelming the few men who were there, killing them before they could organize a defense, before they could even understand what was happening. The traders and the clerks and the agency workers, they had grown complacent. They had believed that we were broken, that we were too weak and too dependent to resist, and they were caught completely by surprise. I was in the group that went to Myric's store. We found him trying to escape through a back window, his face white with terror, his hands shaking as he scrambled through the opening, his fat body getting stuck halfway through, his legs kicking frantically. We dragged him back inside, and I will not describe what we did to him, except to say that when we were finished, his mouth was stuffed full of grass and his body was left in the dirt behind his store as a message, as a symbol, as a payment for his words. I felt no pity then, only a savage satisfaction, a sense that the scales had been balanced, if only for a moment, that justice had been done, that the man who had mocked our hunger had been made to taste the grass he had recommended. But that satisfaction was short-lived, because war is not a single act of revenge, it is a cascade, a flood that sweeps away everything in its path, the guilty and the innocent alike. We moved through the settlements, attacking farms and cabins, killing the men, taking captives, burning buildings. Some of the warriors killed women and children, acts that turned my stomach even then, acts that I tried to stop but could not always prevent. I remember one farm where a woman was shot as she ran from her burning cabin, her baby in her arms. And I remember the warrior who shot her laughing as if it was a great joke, as if the death of a mother and child was something to celebrate. And I remember grabbing him and shouting at him, asking him what kind of man he was, what kind of Dakota killed babies. And he looked at me with wild eyes and said that they had killed our babies, that they had let our children starve, and that this was justice, this was revenge, and I did not know what to say to that, because it was true they had let our children starve. But I also knew that killing their children did not bring ours back, did not make anything right, only added more blood to the river of blood that was already flowing. War makes monsters of men. It strips away the veneer of civilization and reveals the beast beneath. And I saw that beast in the eyes of my brothers, and I feared that I saw it in my own eyes as well. I killed men that day, and in the days that followed, I killed many men, some of them soldiers, some of them settlers, some of them armed and fighting back, some of them running away, some of them begging for mercy. I killed them with arrows and with my war club and with my knife, and each death was different. Each one left its own mark on my soul, its own scar that would never heal. I remember a young settler, a boy really, no older than I was, who I found hiding in a root cellar, his rifle beside him but his hands shaking too badly to use it. He looked at me with terrified eyes and he said, "Please, I have a mother, I have sisters." And I thought of my own mother and sisters and I hesitated. And in that moment of hesitation, he grabbed his rifle and tried to shoot me. And I reacted without thinking, my war club coming down on his skull with a sickening crunch. And he fell and he died. And I stood over his body and I felt sick. Sick with the killing, sick with the war, sick with the whole terrible situation that had brought us to this point. We attacked the ferry crossing at Redwood, killing the soldiers who were stationed there, and then we moved on to Fort Ridgely, a military post that guarded the valley. We laid siege to the fort for 2 days, hundreds of warriors surrounding it, firing arrows and bullets at the wooden walls, trying to set it ablaze with fire arrows, trying to overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers. But the soldiers had cannons, and they fired grape shot into our ranks, cutting down men like wheat before a scythe, the iron balls tearing through flesh and bone, leaving men screaming and writhing on the ground, their bodies torn apart, their blood soaking into the earth. I saw friends die there, men I had hunted with, men I had grown up with, men I had played with as a child, their bodies torn apart by the cannons, their lives snuffed out in an instant. I saw Changtewashte, the young man who was promised to my sister, take a cannonball to the chest, his body literally torn in half, and I thought of my sister and how I would have to tell her, and I felt a despair so deep it was like drowning. We could not take the fort, and after 2 days we withdrew, frustrated and angry, knowing that every hour we delayed gave the whites time to gather their forces, to send for reinforcements, to organize a response. We turned our attention to the town of New Ulm, a settlement of German immigrants on the south side of the river. We attacked twice, burning the outskirts of the town, driving the settlers into the center where they barricaded themselves in the buildings. The fighting was fierce and chaotic, smoke and fire, and the screams of the wounded filling the air, the smell of gunpowder and burning wood and blood thick in my nostrils. I remember shooting arrows at the windows of a brick building, seeing the flashes of rifle fire from inside, feeling the bullets whip past my head like angry hornets, hearing the thud as an arrow struck the wall beside me, so close I could feel the vibration. We killed many, but we could not take the town, and again we withdrew, leaving the buildings burning behind us, leaving the dead lying in the streets, leaving a trail of destruction that would be remembered for generations. For a few weeks it seemed as if we were winning, as if we had driven the whites from our lands, as if the old days might return. We had taken hundreds of captives, mostly women and children, and we held them in our camps, treating them with varying degrees of kindness or cruelty, depending on the individual warrior and his own experiences and his own level of rage. Some warriors treated the captives well, protecting them, feeding them, even adopting them into their families. Others treated them harshly, using them as slaves, abusing them, taking out their anger and frustration on helpless people who had done them no personal harm. I guarded some of the captives and I tried to protect them from the worst abuses, giving them food and water, keeping the more violent men away from them, trying to maintain some shred of humanity in the midst of the chaos. I remember one woman, a young mother with a baby, who looked at me with such fear and hatred that it pierced my heart like an arrow. She flinched every time I came near, clutching her baby to her chest, her eyes wild with terror, and I wanted to tell her that I was not going to hurt her, that I was trying to protect her. But there were no words that could bridge the gulf between us, no way to make her understand that I was both her enemy and a man who pitied her, a man who saw in her face the faces of my own mother and sisters and wondered what had happened to them, if they were safe, if they were still alive. But the whites were gathering their strength. The governor of Minnesota, a man named Alexander Ramsey, called out the militia, and a former trader named Henry Hastings Sibley, a man who knew our lands and our ways, who had lived among us and traded with us for years, was given command of a force of over 1,500 soldiers. They marched up the valley, a long blue column bristling with rifles and cannons, and we knew that the end was coming. Little Crow tried to negotiate, sending messages to Sibley, offering to release the captives in exchange for peace, trying to find some way to end the war before we were all destroyed. But Sibley's terms were unconditional surrender, the surrender of all warriors who had participated in the fighting, the return of all captives, and the submission of the Dakota people to whatever punishment the government deemed appropriate. Those were terms we could not accept, because we knew what the punishment would be. We knew that the whites wanted revenge, wanted blood, wanted to make an example of us that would terrify every other tribe in the West into submission. We prepared for battle, gathering our warriors at a place called Wood Lake near the Upper Agency. It was late September, and the leaves were turning gold and red, the air crisp with the promise of winter, the smell of autumn in the air, the smell of dying things, of endings. We planned an ambush, hiding in the tall grass and the ravines, waiting for Sibley's column to march into our trap, planning to hit them from both sides, to catch them in a crossfire, to overwhelm them before they could organize a defense. But the plan failed. A group of soldiers left the camp early in the morning to forage for potatoes in a nearby field, and they stumbled into our position before we were ready, before the signal had been given, before the warriors were in place. The fighting began prematurely, without coordination. Without the element of surprise, and what should have been an ambush became a confused, chaotic battle with no clear lines, no clear objectives, just men shooting at each other across an open field. We fought hard, charging the soldiers again and again, but they had better weapons, better discipline, and more men. The cannons roared, and the rifle fire was like the sound of hail on a tin roof, constant and deafening, a sound that drowned out everything else. That made it impossible to think, impossible to hear orders, impossible to do anything but fight and try to survive. I fought in the center of the line, shooting arrows until my quiver was empty, then drawing my knife and rushing forward with the others, screaming the war cry, trying to break their line through sheer ferocity, through sheer determination. through sheer refusal to accept defeat. I killed a soldier that day, a young man with a blonde beard, stabbing him in the chest as he tried to reload his rifle, feeling the blade scrape against his ribs, seeing the light go out of his eyes, seeing him fall at my feet. And I felt no triumph, only a sick emptiness, a sense that I had crossed a line from which there was no return, that I had become the very thing I had feared, a killer, a taker of life, a man with blood on his hands that would never wash clean. We were driven back, our lines breaking, our warriors scattering into the prairie and the woods, the battle lost, the war lost, everything lost. Little Crow called a council that night, and we decided to flee, to abandon the valley and head west into the Dakota territory, hoping to find refuge among the Lakota bands. Our cousins on the plains, hoping that they would take us in, that they would protect us from the vengeance that was sure to come. We released the captives, sending them to Sibley's camp under a flag of truce, hoping that this act of mercy might soften the punishment that was sure to come, hoping that the whites would see that we were not monsters, that we had treated the captives as well as we could under the circumstances, that we were willing to make peace. But mercy was not something the whites were prepared to offer. Sibley's soldiers pursued us, and many of the warriors, exhausted and demoralized, their families starving. Their hope gone, surrendered, hoping for fair treatment, hoping that they would be judged as individuals, that those who had not committed murder would be spared, that there would be some kind of justice, some kind of process, some recognition that not all Dakota were guilty, that some had fought only in defense, that some had tried to protect the captives, that some had opposed the war from the beginning. I was among those who surrendered. I walked into the soldier camp with my hands raised, my weapons left behind, and I was immediately put in chains, heavy iron shackles on my wrists and ankles that chafed and cut into my skin. They rounded us up, nearly 2,000 men, and they held a series of trials, if they could be called trials, proceedings that lasted minutes, not hours, with no real defense, no real evidence, just the testimony of settlers who pointed at us and said, "That one was there," or "I think I saw him," or "He looks like the one who killed my husband." The military commission, a panel of officers who knew nothing of our language or our customs, who made no attempt to understand the context of the war, who saw us not as human beings but as savages to be punished, sentenced 303 men to death by hanging. 303. The number was so large, so incomprehensible, that it seemed unreal, like a story told to frighten children, like a nightmare from which I would surely wake. I was among the condemned. I do not know why I was chosen, what specific act I was accused of, because the trial was conducted in English, and I understood only a few words, and no one bothered to translate, no one bothered to explain. No one bothered to ask me if I had killed women or children, if I had tortured anyone, if I had done anything beyond fighting as a warrior in a war that my people had been driven to by starvation and broken promises. I think it was because I had been at Wood Lake, because I had fought, because I had been seen with a weapon in my hand. That was enough. We were held in a prison camp at Fort Snelling, near the junction of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers. Hundreds of men crammed into a wooden stockade, waiting for the sentence to be carried out. The conditions were terrible, cold and filthy, with barely enough food to keep us alive, no blankets, no heat, the wind howling through the cracks in the walls, men dying of disease and despair, their bodies carried out each morning like cordwood and buried in unmarked graves. I spent my days in prayer, singing the old songs, trying to prepare my spirit for the journey to the other side, trying to make peace with my death, trying to find some meaning in what had happened, some reason why the spirits had allowed this to happen, why they had not protected us, why they had not answered our prayers. I thought of my family, of my father and mother and sisters, and I wondered if they were still alive, if they had escaped to the west, or if they too had been caught in the net that the whites had cast over our people. I learned later that most of the Dakota who had not fled were rounded up and held in concentration camps, camps at Fort Snelling and other places, where the conditions were even worse than the prison, where women and children died by the hundreds from disease and starvation and the cold, where they were kept in open pens like animals, exposed to the elements, given barely enough food to survive, subjected to abuse and harassment from the soldiers and the townspeople who came to gawk at them, as if they were exhibits in a zoo. The whites called it justice, but it was revenge, pure and simple. Revenge for the deaths of the settlers. Revenge that did not distinguish between the guilty and the innocent. Revenge that punished an entire people for the actions of a few. Revenge that sought to erase us, to break us, to make us disappear. In November, word came that President Lincoln himself had reviewed the sentences and that he had commuted most of them, reducing the number to be hanged from 303 to 38. I was still among them. I do not know why Lincoln chose to spare some and not others, what criteria he used, what mercy he thought he was showing. I learned later that he had reviewed the trial records, such as they were, and had decided to execute only those who had been convicted of murder or rape of civilians, as opposed to those who had simply fought as warriors in battles. But the records were so poor, the trials so rushed and so biased, that it was impossible to know who had actually done what. And I suspect that many innocent men were hanged, while many guilty men were spared, simply because of the randomness of the testimony, the luck of who had been seen where, the vagaries of memory and prejudice and fear. Perhaps Lincoln believed that hanging 38 men was justice, while hanging 300 was massacre. Perhaps he was trying to balance the demands of the Minnesota settlers, who wanted us all dead, who were screaming for blood, who were threatening to take matters into their own hands if the government did not act. With his own sense of morality, his own understanding that collective punishment was wrong, that individuals should be judged for their individual actions. I do not know, and it does not matter, because 38 men were still going to die, and I was one of them, and the fact that 265 others had been spared was no comfort to me as I waited in that cold, dark prison for the day of my execution. We were moved to Mankato in December, transported in wagons under heavy guard, the townspeople lining the roads to jeer at us, to throw stones and spit, to scream for our blood, their faces twisted with hatred, their voices shrill with rage, calling us murderers and savages and demons, calling for us to be tortured, to be burned alive, to be torn apart by horses. The hatred in their faces was like a physical force, a wall of rage and fear that pressed against us from all sides, and I understood then that there would be no mercy, no compassion, no recognition of our humanity, that in their eyes we were not men but monsters, not human beings but vermin to be exterminated. We were held in a building in the center of town, and we could hear the construction of the scaffold outside, the hammering of nails, the sawing of wood, the sound of our deaths being built board by board, the sound that went on for days, a constant reminder of what was coming, a sound that invaded our dreams and our waking hours, a sound that said, "Your time is short, your life is ending, prepare yourself." On the night of December 25th, Christmas night, a night that the whites celebrated as the birth of their God of love and forgiveness, a night of joy and family and peace, we were told that the execution would take place the next day. We spent the night singing the old songs, the death songs, the songs that would carry our spirits to the other side, the songs that said we were Dakota, that we were warriors, that we were not afraid. We sang of our fathers and our grandfathers, of the buffalo and the eagle, of the land that had been ours and would never be ours again, of the women we had loved and the children we had fathered and the lives we had lived. We sang without stopping, our voices rising and falling in the darkness, a sound that must have chilled the blood of the guards and the townspeople who heard it, a sound that said we were not broken, that we would die as we had lived, as Dakota, as men, as free spirits that no rope could truly bind. On the morning of December 26, 1862, they came for us. They bound our hands behind our backs and led us out into the cold winter air, the sun just rising, the sky pale and clear, the air so cold it burned the lungs, and we walked in a line, 38 men, through the streets of Mankato to the scaffold that had been built in the center of town. The crowd was enormous. Thousands of people packed into the streets and the buildings around the square, their faces eager and hungry, waiting to see us die, waiting for the spectacle, waiting for justice as they understood it. We climbed the steps of the scaffold, a massive square platform with 38 nooses hanging from a beam above, and we stood in a line, and we continued to sing, our voices strong and clear, even as they placed the nooses around our necks, even as they tied our legs so we could not struggle, even as they pulled the white hoods over our faces so that we could not see. I could not see, but I could hear my brothers singing beside me, and I joined my voice to theirs, singing the song my father had taught me, the song of the warrior who goes to meet his ancestors with courage and honor, the song that said I was not afraid, that I welcomed death, that I was ready to cross over to the other side where my grandfathers waited, where the buffalo still ran and the prairie was still free, and the white man had never come. I felt the rough hemp of the rope against my throat, and I felt the cold wind on my skin, and I felt the platform tremble beneath my feet as the other men shifted their weight, and I knew that in a moment, in a heartbeat, it would all be over, that the pain and the struggle and the long defeat would be finished, and I would be free. I thought of my mother's face, of her smile, of the way she sang as she worked, and I thought of my sisters, of Wichapi's beauty and Tisangwing's laughter, and I thought of my father's wisdom and his strength, and I hoped that they were safe, that they had survived, that they would remember me, that my name would not be forgotten. I thought of the smell of sage and cedar, of the taste of wild rice and fresh venison, of the sound of the river in the spring and the wind in the cottonwoods, of the feel of a horse beneath me and a bow in my hand, of all the things that had made life worth living, all the things that I was about to lose, and then I heard the sound of the drum, a single beat, the signal, and the platform dropped away beneath me, and there was a moment of falling, a moment of weightlessness, and then the rope caught and the world exploded in pain and darkness, and I felt my neck snap and I was falling into a darkness deeper than any night, falling into a silence more complete than any I had ever known. But I did not die. The rope broke, or perhaps it was not tied correctly, or perhaps the spirits intervened, I do not know, but I fell to the ground beneath the scaffold, gasping and choking, my neck burning like fire, my vision blurred, stars exploding behind my eyes, and I heard the roar of the crowd, a sound of confusion and anger and disbelief, and I felt hands grabbing me, rough hands dragging me to my feet, and I knew that they would not let me escape, that they would hang me again, that they would make sure the job was done this time. They dragged me back up the steps, my legs barely able to support me, my body broken, my mind reeling, and they put a new rope around my neck, thicker this time. And they checked the knot and they pushed me back into position, and I heard someone say, "Make sure it holds this time." And I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, at the fact that I was being hanged twice, that even in death I could not escape the incompetence and the cruelty of the whites. The platform dropped again, and this time the rope held and the darkness came. But it was not the darkness of death, it was the darkness of unconsciousness. My body shutting down, my brain starved of oxygen, and when I woke, I was lying on the ground, my body broken, my neck bruised and swollen, barely able to breathe, barely able to move, but alive. I learned later that I was the only one of the 38 who survived, if you can call it survival. The others died that day, their bodies left hanging for an hour as a spectacle for the crowd, and then cut down and thrown into a mass grave, a pit dug at the edge of town, their bodies piled on top of each other like cordwood. No ceremony, no prayers, no respect, just disposal. The elimination of a problem. But even that was not the end of their humiliation, because that night, doctors from the town came and dug up some of the bodies and took them away to be dissected, to be studied, to be used for medical experiments. Their bodies violated even in death, treated not as human remains, but as specimens, as objects of curiosity. I was taken back to the prison, and I was held there for months, recovering slowly, my voice ruined, my neck permanently damaged, my body weak, my spirit shattered. I could not speak above a whisper, could not turn my head without pain, could not swallow without difficulty. I was eventually released, not out of mercy, but because they did not know what else to do with me. A man who had been sentenced to death and had not died, a ghost, a reminder of their own brutality, an embarrassment, an anomaly that did not fit into their categories of guilt and punishment. I was sent west, exiled from Minnesota, forced to leave the land of my fathers, the land where my ancestors were buried, the land that held every memory of my life before the war, the land that was soaked with the blood of my people and the tears of our women. I was put on a steamboat with the other Dakota, who had been spared, the women and children and old men, and we were taken down the Mississippi and then up the Missouri to a barren reservation in the Dakota Territory, a place called Crow Creek, a place of alkali flats and bad water and no game, a place where we were expected to farm land that would not grow crops, a place that was more prison than home, a place where hundreds more of our people died in the years that followed, slowly, miserably, forgotten by the government that had promised to care for us. I wandered for years, living among the Lakota, among the Cheyenne, always moving, always running, never finding peace, never finding a place where I belonged, never finding a way to reconcile what I had done and what had been done to me, never finding a way to make sense of the senseless, to find meaning in the meaningless. I saw Little Crow one more time, or rather, I saw his body. In the summer of 1863, he had been killed by a farmer near Hutchinson, shot while picking berries with his son, his body mutilated and put on display in the town. His scalp taken as a trophy, his body thrown into a pit. They did not even know who he was when they killed him. They just saw an Indian and they shot him, and only later did they realize that they had killed the man they called the leader of the uprising, the man they blamed for all the blood that had been spilled, the man whose name had become synonymous with savagery and rebellion. His body was thrown into a pit, and his scalp and his skull were later dug up and put in a museum in St. Paul, displayed like the bones of an animal, a curiosity, a relic of a vanished people, an object to be stared at and studied and used to teach white children about the dangers of the savage Indian. It was not until 1971, more than 100 years after his death, that his remains were finally returned to his descendants and given a proper burial. I am an old man now, my hair white, my body bent, my voice a hoarse whisper that is all that remains of the songs I once sang, the voice that was broken on the scaffold at Mankato and never healed. I have outlived my time, outlived my people, outlived the world I was born into. The Dakota are scattered, broken, living on reservations far from our homeland, our language dying, our traditions fading, our children learning the white man's ways and forgetting the ways of their grandfathers, forgetting the stories, forgetting the songs, forgetting who they are and where they came from. The land where I was born, the valley of the Minnesota River, is covered with farms and towns and roads, and the white people who live there do not know the history beneath their feet, do not know that the soil they plow is soaked with the blood of my people, do not hear the songs of the dead that rise from the earth like mist in the morning, do not feel the presence of the spirits that still walk those lands, mourning, remembering, waiting. I think often of that day in Mankato, of the 37 men who died beside me, of the songs we sang, of the courage we showed in the face of death, of the dignity we maintained even as the nooses were placed around our necks, even as the crowd screamed for our blood, even as we stood on the edge of the abyss and looked into the darkness and did not flinch. I think of their names, their faces, their stories, and I carry them with me, a burden and an honor, a responsibility to remember, to bear witness, to ensure that they are not forgotten, that their deaths meant something, that their sacrifice was not in vain. I think of the choices we made, the path we took, and I wonder if it could have been different, if there was another way. A way that did not lead to the scaffold and the mass grave and the long exile. A way that would have allowed us to keep our lands and our way of life without the bloodshed and the horror. But I know in my heart that there was no other way, that the whites wanted our land and they would take it with or without our consent, with or without a war, that they had the numbers and the weapons and the will to take what they wanted, and that nothing we could have done would have changed the outcome. The uprising was not the cause of our destruction, it was the result of it, the final, desperate act of a people who had been pushed beyond endurance, who had been starved and cheated and humiliated until they had nothing left to lose, until the only choice left was to fight or to die without fighting, to resist or to submit, to strike back or to simply disappear. We fought because we were Dakota, because we were men, because we could not simply lie down and die without striking back, without making them feel, even for a moment, the pain they had inflicted on us, without asserting our humanity, our right to exist, our refusal to be erased. And we lost as Little Crow knew we would lose, as the elders knew we would lose, as perhaps we all knew in our hearts we would lose, but we lost on our feet, with weapons in our hands and songs on our lips, And that is something, even if it is not enough, even if it did not save us, even if it only brought more suffering and more death. The execution at Mankato was meant to be a lesson, a warning to all Indians that resistance was futile, that the power of the United States was absolute, that we must submit or die, that there was no place for us in the new order, that we must either become like the whites or disappear. And it worked in a way, because after 1862, there were no more uprisings in Minnesota, no more wars, only the slow grinding process of assimilation and dispossession, the reservations and the boarding schools and the slow death of a culture, the deliberate, systematic destruction of everything that made us Dakota, everything that connected us to our past, to our land, to our identity. But it also failed because the memory of that day, the memory of those 38 men singing their death songs as the nooses were placed around their necks, that memory did not die. It lived on, passed down from father to son, from grandmother to grandchild, a story of courage and defiance, a story that said we were here, we existed, we fought, and we will not be forgotten, a story that became part of the fabric of our people, part of our identity, part of what it means to be Dakota. I carry that memory now. I am the keeper of it, the last living link to that day, and it is a burden heavier than any load I have ever carried, heavier than the stone I carried in my vision quest, heavier than the deer I carried on my shoulders after my first hunt, heavier than all the years of my long life. I see their faces in my dreams, the faces of my brothers who died, and I hear their songs and I feel the rope around my neck, and I wake in the darkness gasping for air, my heart pounding, my body drenched in sweat, and I am back on that scaffold, back in that moment, and I know that I will never be free of it, that it will follow me until the day I die and perhaps beyond. I have lived a long life, longer than I ever expected, longer than I deserved perhaps, and I have seen things that I wish I had not seen, done things that I wish I had not done, and I carry the weight of those things like stones in my chest, like a burden that grows heavier with each passing year. I do not know if what we did was right or wrong, if the war was justified or if it was madness, if the blood we spilled was a payment for the blood that had been spilled, or if it was just more blood, adding to the river of blood that has flowed through this land since the first white man set foot on it, a river that has never stopped flowing, that flows still. I only know that we were human, that we were pushed beyond the breaking point, and that we broke, and that the breaking was terrible and tragic and inevitable, and that the consequences of that breaking are still being felt today, more than 60 years later, in the scattered remnants of my people, in the empty lands where we once lived, in the silence where once there were songs. Today, the town of Mankato still stands, and there is a small plaque near the place where the scaffold was built, a plaque that mentions the execution, the largest mass execution in the history of the United States. But it does not tell the whole story. It does not speak of the starvation and the broken promises and the words of Andrew Myrick. It does not speak of the thousands of Dakota who died in the camps. It does not speak of the children who were torn from their families and sent to boarding schools to have their language and their culture beaten out of them, to have their hair cut and their names changed and their spirits broken. It does not speak of the long, slow genocide that followed the war, the deliberate policy of cultural destruction that continued for generations. It is a small plaque, easily missed, and most people walk past it without stopping, without reading, without knowing, without caring. The white people who live in Minnesota now, they have built their world on the ruins of ours, and they do not think about the cost. They do not think about the people who were here before them, the people who loved this land and lived in harmony with it for thousands of years, before the plow and the fence and the railroad came, the people who knew every stream and every hill and every grove of trees, who had names for every place and stories for every landmark, who were part of the land in a way that the whites can never be, because they see the land as property, as something to be owned and exploited, while we saw it as our mother, as the source of all life, as something to be honored and respected and cared for. They do not hear the songs of the dead, but I do. I hear them every day, in the wind that blows across the prairie, in the cry of the hawk, in the rustle of the cottonwood leaves, in the sound of the river flowing over stones, in the silence of the winter snow. I hear them and I remember, and I will remember until the day I die, and then perhaps my spirit will join theirs, and we will sing together in the place beyond this world, the place where there is no hunger, no war, no broken promises, Only the eternal turning of the seasons and the presence of the great mystery that holds us all, that connects us all. That is the source and the end of all things. This was the story of Tathanka Nazing Standing Buffalo, of the Mdewakanton, Dakota. These are the histories that are not written in the schoolbooks. If you were moved by this testament and believe these voices must be heard, please take a moment to honor their legacy. Like this video to help it reach others. Subscribe to Tribal Lore to ensure you don't miss another chapter of our shared past. And most importantly, leave a comment below. Tell us what part of this story resonated with you, or suggest a piece of history you believe we should uncover next. Your engagement is the fire that keeps these stories alive. Thank you for listening.